Good afternoon. We are so excited to have all of you here today, either in person or virtually, for the 5th annual NHPF Symposium, A Decade of Rental Housing Vulnerability, Lessons Learned from Financial Crisis to Coronavirus. We are fortunate enough to have a message from Sylvester Turner, the mayor of Houston, whose words really set the stage for what we are doing here today. Please stop whatever you're doing and let's hear from Mayor Turner now.
Hello, I'm Sylvester Turner, Mayor, City of Houston. I am so glad to be part of the NHP 2021 Symposium, where this year we are focusing on the lessons learned over the past decade that we can apply to improve the lives of those living in rental properties. Here in Houston, we know a thing or two about responding to and recovering from disasters, whether it's a serious storm like Hurricane Harvey or an unprecedented cold snap like Winter Storm Uri. With every event, we learn more about what the city needs and how we can improve to make our residents more resilient. We have begun to implement higher standards for the types of homes that we build and are leveraging the resources we have to keep us prepared. For example, the Edison Lofts development in Fort Bend, Houston, that features 126 mixed-income units, also includes a small solar farm that offsets 100% of the electrical costs for the development's community center and leasing office. But it's not just the larger multifamily developments that we see this type of innovation. Our Harvey Recovery Small Rental Program builds communities with 1 to 7 units, where the developers are small, community-based nonprofit organizations. By participating in this program, they are building experience so that we have a pipeline of developers in the future we can rely on. Plus, these developers are organizations based in Houston and whose regular scope of work is done in service to Houston. So it isn't just resilient infrastructure, but we are providing opportunities to people who will then be able to weather the storm better because they have been able to expand their own experience and expertise. Being a good steward of the federal relief dollars that come in following a disaster is imperative to creating a better and safer experience for residents. Many of our affordable apartments were built during a time when developers couldn't predict the impacts of climate change. Those apartments are aging, and many are in dangerous areas like the floodway. With disaster recovery funding, not only are we addressing the dangers of those apartments, but we are able to leverage more resources. Low-income housing tax credits have always been a pillar of our community to attract affordable development to Houston. Since 2019, Houston has implemented more rigorous standards around which developer applications we will approve. In other words, which ones get reviewed by our friends in the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We have raised the bar, and the applications approved by the City of Houston are impressing the TDHCA, and they're impressing us. The city's role in maintaining affordable housing is more important than ever, given the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted the cost of home ownership. So when the city works with the developers, we hold them to high standards that lead to more and better quality homes. Things like ensuring good labor standards, so the home building industry is safe and accessible. We're also mindful of environmental standards that will protect our residents and ensure a neighborhood's ability to recover with less damage. And these developments are placed throughout the city, prioritizing places that don't already have many affordable options. Ultimately, we approach housing developments in Houston in a way that will leave the resident with a feeling of dignity and self-respect. We want to provide options that meet people where they are and provide access that allows them to do the things they would like to do. Thank you, NHP, for hosting this symposium and the continuous work you do in preserving affordable housing for people across the country.
Hello, I'm Ralph Boyd, the chairman of the NHP Foundation and co-chair of our 5th annual symposium and first ever virtual and in-person event, which is entitled A Decade of Rental Housing Vulnerability, Lessons Learned from the Financial Crisis to Coronavirus. Welcome to the folks who have gathered in person at Union Station, and also to those participating remotely. It's been a year has become a popular way to describe the last 12 months and then some, an understatement to be sure, as we learn to live with COVID-19, usher in a new administration, and grapple with ongoing racial and social upheaval. But as many might say, and we agree, the phrase should really be, it's been a decade, as we look to the financial and socioeconomic turmoil and change the country's experienced in the years since the Great Recession and the onset of the coronavirus. Examining affordable housing vulnerability through this lens and across this timeline in order to construct a more resilient future to house Americans securely, that is the goal of this symposium. We are so proud to be presenting our 5th annual gathering of those in the affordable housing ecosystem, and we wish to acknowledge the people and the companies that continue to support this work and make the symposium possible. A heartfelt thank you to our sponsors, whose names you'll see throughout the program, and thank you to all of our attendees. And finally, I wish to recognize my co-chairs for this year's event. Sarah E. Feinberg, founder of Feinberg Strategies LLC, and Sherry Santos Woost, the managing partner of Celadon Venture Advisors. At this time, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our evening's proceedings, Laura DiMaria, the executive director of the National Association for County, Community, and Economic Development, NACCED, which represents local government agencies, community development, and affordable housing programs across the nation. Laura also launched and hosts NACCED's lively and engaging podcast, the Holistic Housing Podcast, which has received mention by both CNN and the Washington Post. Laura will be our guide through a timely and thought-provoking program, including reporting from the Enterprise Community Partners on a trenchant national study and stimulating conversations with a veritable who's who in America's affordable housing policy and implementation sectors. Our aim is for you to leave here with information to help drive positive, consequential change in the housing, social justice, and other decisions you're involved in making. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Laura DiMaria and officially begin the program.
Thank you, Ralph. For those of us striving to increase and improve the state of American affordable housing, examining the policies and events that have created its current vulnerability will help us build a more resilient future. And this event provides the springboard. The symposium was founded as a bastion of continuing bipartisanship. To that end, we will be presenting 4 awards that will recognize congresspeople from both sides of the aisle. You will also be the first to hear the results of a national survey NHPF undertook with Enterprise Community Partners, asking for insights from affordable housing decision makers. We will be looking at lessons learned and future strategies from 3 conversations, individually with mayors of prominent U.S. cities, key state housing agency partners, and leaders in policy and academia. Finally, we will hear from Kimberly Jones, a prolific human rights activist, author, director, and speaker who has become a change agent within the social justice movement. Like you, I have come to know and respect the work of the NHP Foundation, which is dedicated to preserving and creating sustainable, service-enriched multifamily housing. The organization flourishes because of its people, and particularly under the guidance of its visionary president and CEO, Dick Burns, who will kick off the program with our first award presentation.
Thank you, Laura. The last decade has seen our country experience a series of hardships and rebounds. As providers of affordable housing, we have witnessed these cycles firsthand and know that it takes hard work and committed leadership to bring substantive positive change to successfully deal with each crisis that comes along. Special people are those who are willing to step up and make a difference. This describes the people we are honoring tonight. with the NHPF Affordable Housing Trailblazer Award. This award recognizes two outstanding lawmakers who have worked in bipartisan fashion to sustain and improve conditions for the preservation and creation of affordable housing. This year, we are pleased to honor Representative Ann Wagner of Missouri, who serves on the House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services. Her accomplishments are several pieces of housing legislation targeting some of the neediest and most overlooked populations, including survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. She's also been widely recognized for her work on the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. That program provides states and local communities with the flexible resources needed to rebuild affordable housing and infrastructure after disaster. Thank you, Representative Wagner, for all you do. We are also pleased to honor Representative Nydia Velazquez of New York, the first Puerto Rican woman elected to the House of Representatives. Representative Velazquez recently joined 27 bicameral members of Congress to call on the Biden administration to reestablish the Obama-era affordable housing program and has worked tirelessly to support efforts combining market-driven housing solutions with federal, state, and local initiatives. The Congresswoman is a strong advocate for public housing residents and has advocated for the preservation and revitalization of government-owned housing property. Thank you, Congressman Velazquez, for your tireless support of those in need.
It is heartening to know that our legislators continue the pursuit of positive, industrious, and beneficial work to ensure against affordable housing vulnerability. We feel it is within all of our power to look at the mistakes, the lessons, the losses, and the victories, and craft forward-thinking ways to create and preserve the most resilient affordable housing for all. To that end, NHPF has again joined forces with enterprise community partners to produce a study examining 10 years of housing challenges, beginning with the Great Recession to the pandemic that brought the world to its knees. Here with the eye-opening results is Andrew Jakubovics, VP, Policy Development, Enterprise Community Partners, Inc. Andrew oversees policy development and research related to affordable housing, equitable housing and community development, housing finance, foreclosures and neighborhood stabilization, and broader housing supply and demand concerns. His long career also includes time spent as a policy advisor at HUD. And with that, let's turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Laura. Really excited to be able to share the results of our survey that we conducted with NHP Foundation with the help of eConsult Solutions and SC Consulting on a decade of rental housing vulnerability, lessons learned from the financial crisis to the coronavirus. The survey looked at the question of vulnerable rental housing over the last 15 years, and we asked questions about perceived inequities in the affordable housing marketplace and the extent to which different actors have a responsibility to address them. We asked specific questions about key policy innovations in three particular time periods: the Great Recession and its aftermath in 2008 through 2011, the period that we call Rebuilding in a Divided U.S. from 2012 to 2019, and the pandemic and social upheaval of the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021. You'll note on the left side a series of key policy innovations that we asked questions about, showing the years in which they were in force and the dates in which they began. Overlaid on top of that also is Superstorm Sandy and the hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and the 2017 California wildfires, both of which are indications of housing vulnerability and individual population vulnerability in light of climate change. As we think about policies moving forward, and many of those policies that were implemented in the past have those forward-looking arrows, climate change is going to continue to be an important component of the state of the housing market, and understanding the vulnerabilities of the housing stock and for the vulnerable populations that live in it, addressing their needs will be critical moving forward. So understanding how we've intervened in the past and how effective those interventions are were some of the guidelines that we're trying to provide to you today. Renter vulnerability over time, just for as a little bit of background, we see that in 1990 and 2000, there was definitely renter vulnerability in terms of cost burden. So these are folks who are living and spending more than 30% of their income on rent. If you're moderately cost burdened, you're spending somewhere between 30 and 50% of your income on rent. And if you're severely cost burdened, you are spending more than half of your income on rent. And rent here includes both rent and utilities. So it's kind of the cost of living in your place of residence. Your shelter costs for renters are calculated this way. And we can see a significant jump between 2000 and 2008. The number of households that are considered cost burdened peaked in 2014 and have really only come down very, very modestly since then. So over the last decade, we're basically at stasis in terms of the number of cost-burdened renters. And unfortunately, this data set only runs through 2019 because of COVID. We do not have a 2020 survey from the American Community Survey, but we do have another census survey known as the Census Pulse Survey that was rolled out. It's a biweekly survey during the period of COVID. And so from the most recent 2-week period that ended at the end of September, we know that 7.3 million renter households report not being current on their rent. This is down by about 1 million households from the same time last year, but that's still 14% of all renters. So that's about 1 in 7 renters who are that vulnerable. And we know that that vulnerability is not equally distributed across all demographic groups. So while the overall number is that about 14% of renters report not being current, among Black renters who do not identify as Hispanic, that number is 23%, or almost 1 in 4 renters in that demographic group report not being current on their rent. Among Hispanic and Latinx respondents, the number is still above average at 17%, down at 9% for white respondents. So we see that there is a legacy. We know that there is a legacy of racial discrimination and disparate policies in housing, and we see some of those effects persisting to today. And we'll talk about that more later as we walk through the survey results. But for now, let's look at the policies themselves that we asked about in those 3 time periods. So during the Great Recession and its aftermath, which was the period from 2008 to 2011, we identified the TCAP and exchange program as the most effective program based on the responses from the survey. And it was most highly ranked among both public sector respondents, those who identified as being part of the finance sector, and those who identified as others. But this is also a program that was a one-time program, and a large number of respondents also reported that they were unfamiliar with how the program worked and were unsure how to rank it, which is a perfectly valid response, but doesn't factor into these rankings. And so it ranks highly, but there is what we call a recency bias in the response to some of these because a lot of folks were unfamiliar with that particular program. Programs that also ranked highly were the extended unemployment benefits of 2008. And that was especially ranked highly by those identified as academics or researchers, and is a program that folks were definitely familiar with. Other programs from that time period were the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which ranked highly among developers, but poorly among those who identified as being part of the public sector. And the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act ranked close to that, and it was also lower ranked, though, among owners and developers and finance professionals. So we see that while programs overall tended to cluster in terms of their perceived effectiveness, there were differences among different types of respondents. And then the lowest ranking program that we asked about in this time period was the initial funding round of the Capital Magnet Fund. And many of those folks were both familiar with it, but it was ranked low among public sector employees and academics. And a lot of the others reported not being familiar with that initial round of funding. It does come back, as you'll see in the next slide, as a funding tool, I should say, that is available on a going forward basis and is revived in 2016, scored roughly the same, but does not rank among the top programs in the Rebuilding in a Divided United States, which was the period from 2012 to 2019. The highest ranking program there was the Rental Assistance Demonstration. It allows for the recapitalization of public housing programs by bringing in private sector funding to assist with long-term affordability. And it was the top overall ranked program in this period and ranked well also among the public sector respondents and those involved in housing finance. National Housing Trust Fund, a well-known program, was the top choice among owner developers and academics. So again, a little bit of a difference in perspective among the different respondents. But again, both of those programs ranked into the good range, as well as the Choice Neighborhoods program, which was the lowest ranked, but it received fairly good scores overall, but was hampered in part by the lack of large amounts of funding to support the program, which is one of the reasons why it had a higher number of respondents who rated it as poor. Most recently, the pandemic and social upheaval, a lot of federal efforts to address the pandemic. The most effective two tools of any time periods were the direct rental assistance and the increase in capital for housing that came in various forms. Direct rental assistance scored the most in terms of outstandings, which is notable. And the increase in capital for housing, we can attribute the high score to the large number of respondents who ranked it as good, with a 4. And so on average, both of those ended up balancing out. The direct rental assistance received the top rankings among public sector and finance professionals, but the lowest among academics and researchers, even though they tended to evaluate all of the programs in this time period roughly the same. The increase in capital for housing tied, but it was the top choice among owners and developers and those in the other category, but was actually the least popular among the researchers. So again, you kind of see some of the differences in outcomes. And actually the utility cutoff among academics was the one thing that actually scored the highest, even though on balance did not do as well as the other two top ranked programs. And then the eviction moratoria that are still in place in some places, in certain instances, were the bottom ranked among every group except the researchers who ranked it highly as well. But overall, the pandemic and social upheaval responses, we asked a question about the policy period in general. The period that we're in at the moment, this pandemic response and social upheaval era, received the highest ratings in terms of interventions and policy effectiveness. So one of the things that I think is an important takeaway, and we'll talk about this at the end, is the fact that we seem to be learning something over time, and we've been more aggressive and more effective in terms of the support. And I think that's something that is likely, or hopefully is something that we can see continue. Again, we'll see that towards the end, that there is wind behind the sails for these types of interventions. Shifting gears a little bit, looking now at the second half of the survey, we asked about policy responses over time in the first half, and then we asked about perspectives on housing issues in the second half of the survey. And we asked a fairly simple but not tightly defined question, so people can interpret the question of, is housing a human right, from their own perspectives. But overwhelmingly, and this was not something I was necessarily expecting to find, even among a group that deals with housing and understands the needs of the residents intimately. Nevertheless, quite heartening to see, I will say, that almost 90% overall of respondents found that housing is a basic human right. Interestingly, the owners and developers had the largest share, although these 1 or 2% changes, differences are not necessarily significant given the size of the pools of respondents. But overwhelmingly, respondents argued that they believed, or said they believed, that housing is a basic human right. We also asked about the extent to which people perceive that people of color struggle to access and keep affordable housing relative to the total population. Similarly, 88% of respondents said absolutely, they saw it, including 63% who said that people of color struggle much more than the average individual in this country, and 25% said that people of color struggle slightly more. But overall, so that adds up to the 88% who saw that people of color struggled to access and keep affordable housing relative to the total population. And we asked a question about the reasons for it, and the primary causes for disparate access to quality housing were overwhelmingly attributed to long-term racial discrimination in real estate, lending practices, and federal housing policy, all of which we're focusing on this evening, as well as income and employment disparities. Again, so the issue is that the housing has to both be there, and you have to be able to afford it for it to be both available and affordable for an individual family. And building off of that, and this is what this slide shows, we asked about where the responsibility lies to address the problem. And so, which stakeholders should bear primary responsibility for addressing racial and ethnic disparities in accessing and keeping affordable housing? We asked it as a primary responsibility was the language of the question, but we allowed respondents to select multiple answers within each. So we break this out here because I think it's important to sort of see and identify that this is one of the places where there was a significant gap between one group of respondents and others. Overall, now looking at the right side of the screen, we see that 92% among all the respondents who did not identify as being a developer or property owner felt that government has the primary responsibility, but that developers had 60% felt that developers also shared a primary responsibility. When you look over on the left side of the screen, there was a perception that slightly fewer of them felt that government had a primary responsibility, but developers said that basically for themselves, only 37% of them felt that developers shared that primary responsibility. Interestingly, local citizens were perceived to have, on balance, responsibility, right? More than 50% of respondents said that local citizens, and 2/3 of respondents said that lenders or investors also have responsibility for addressing racial and ethnic disparities. And so we see that those obligations potentially reflected in the way that they respond to things like the Community Reinvestment Act obligations that they might have, as well as fair lending responsibilities. Among developers and property owners, the obligations for those other groups were perceived to be a little bit lower. We also turned the question on the respondents themselves, and we said, do you have the ability to address racial and ethnic disparities in your position? Overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. 81% of respondents said yes in various forms, including almost half of all respondents saying, yeah, I believe that I have the ability and I act on it, that alleviating such disparities is central to how I approach my work. Another 26% agreed that they have the ability, but they are sometimes constrained by political or other factors in their ability to act. And another 10% said that they do have the ability, but it's not a primary focus. So it's something that they work on, but it is not their core responsibility. And among the no's, only 4% said the question wasn't well targeted because they didn't perceive such disparities. And then another 15% said that they do not have the ability within their position and they cannot address those disparities directly. So those disparities persist, but they do not have the ability to act on them. I think that's really important to keep in mind as we move to our key takeaways from the survey. We asked in the aggregate what kind of policies, if well implemented, would be most effective. And these key takeaways draw not only on those more abstract types of policies, but also the policies that ranked highly when asked about specifically in the early part of the survey. So we've got 4 key takeaways. And these are our observations about the policies and programs that are perceived to have the greatest impact. And we think this is important for all stakeholders to understand. It can be the springboard for the conversations you're going to hear after this presentation, as well as it gives a good concrete set of actions that can be shared broadly to ensure that policymakers continue to support effective programs at all levels of government. We'll talk about that momentarily. But the one key takeaway is the importance of capital support for vulnerable housing. It's necessary and it's effective. And the respondents generally considered the most effective programs over the last decade plus that we asked about, as well as in the abstract about well-designed programs, that these programs that increase the supply of affordable homes, including through preserving the ones that are most at risk of loss, are really critical. So again, going back to that early slide, when we looked at the range of policies, when we think about the legacy of discriminatory policies and the implications, overlaying also the risk of climate change and disasters on the housing stock and on vulnerable housing and vulnerable people, that providing ongoing capital support to produce affordable homes, preserving the ones that we have, so that they can be resilient to the conditions that are likely coming down the road is really important. It's also really important, key takeaway, is to respond at every level of government. Different levels of government have different roles in the housing ecosystem, but each has an important role to play. So at the federal and state level, funding is critical, but also identifying the regulations that direct private capital to underserved communities plays an important role in ensuring the affordable housing remains available and of good quality, but also expanding access to places with high opportunity. And we have to think about also easing local barriers to availability, affordability. So even local government has an important role to play. And part of that is the collective responsibility. And as we saw from the responses in the last several slides, the willingness to address discriminatory policies and their legacies, that the timing is good to pursue policies and programs at all levels of government that are designed specifically to reverse the decades of redlining and invest in long underserved populations and places. So there is will to do it, and we need to see the types of policies put in place to effectuate that. And ultimately, these policies are deemed to be effective, but unfortunately, they don't reach everyone. The policies put in place at various points since 2008 have been perceived to be effective and impactful in supporting affordable rental housing. But one of the things that we know, both from this particular survey as well as other research that's been done, is that not all demographic groups have been equally well served. In this particular survey, seniors and veterans, the policies and housing designed to serve them have been perceived as the most effective of the various policies. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's perceived that immigrants and returning citizens, those emerging from the criminal justice or that have been justice involved, are least well served by the affordable housing system and policies that we have in place today. Between those two, there are other groups that fall along a continuum, but on balance, low-income families are generally considered to be adequately served, but certainly not fully served by the system in place. And we know that certainly on the voucher side, only 1 in 4 households that are eligible for vouchers receive them. That is a tremendous challenge to accessibility, even if the homes themselves are in the supply is available. Their ability to access them is definitely constrained because of the support on that side of the ledger. So looking forward, again, we think this is incredibly important. There is an opportunity for robust conversations, not only this evening, which you're about to see, but also with policymakers, with other stakeholders, that none of us are operating in a vacuum, and there is a collective will to address the challenges that we have. So it's not a time to take our foot off the gas, that the legacy of the challenges that we have are real, they persist, as we've seen, and the willingness to do the hard work to make sure that vulnerable people and vulnerable properties continue to be on a path towards improvement rather than withdrawing, I think is really important. And so let's all work together to address these challenges. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and everyone who participated in the survey. All of the results point to the kind of clear-eyed remediation, red tape cutting, and creative ideation it will take to move the needle on affordable housing for the future. We're also pleased to let everyone know that the information from Andrew's presentation and all of tonight's conversations will be distilled into an industry report we will share soon after the event. And now, to delve deeper, we are pleased to invite you to listen in on our candid, relevant conversations with some of our nation's preeminent difference makers when it comes to building and preserving affordable housing. It is our pleasure to host this conversation with Miami, Florida Mayor Francis Suarez, and to learn his thoughts on potential solutions for shoring up America's vulnerable affordable housing. It is said that Miami takes skill and charm to manage, and Mayor Suarez, known for his "how can I help" approach, seems to possess those skills. Suarez won his first mayoral run in 2017 with almost 86% of the vote, and is showing his commitment to affordable housing by utilizing public-private partnerships to build multifamily affordable rental homes in his city. This includes workforce housing that allows low-income workers to live in the more affluent neighborhoods where they work. I also have it on good authority that affordable housing is an obsession for Mayor Suarez. So we're very excited about this conversation. And Mayor Suarez, welcome. It's great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. An honor to be with you. And it is a healthy obsession, without a doubt. Listen, there are certain things and certain issues that drive you and provide passion for public service. And for me, affordable housing is one of those things. It's one of the great equalizers that gives people an opportunity to live in dignity and also be able to better themselves as they are working on their education, working on their craft, working on their profession, and just allowing them to live with a level of dignity that they deserve.
Yep, absolutely. So as you know, Mayor Suarez, the theme of this symposium is a decade of rental housing vulnerability, lessons learned from the financial crisis to coronavirus. And as a part of this event, we conducted a survey of stakeholders across the whole affordable housing industry to determine how certain programs and events have impacted affordable housing and what measures can be taken to ensure future affordable housing is more resilient. So we've got a couple questions for you today, and I want to start with a basic one, which is that in thinking about federal and local legislation and the policies that affect the creation and preservation of affordable housing in your own city, Miami, can you tell us which programs have been most or least effective?
I think, the tax credit programs have been extremely effective. We have in Florida 4% and 9% deals. The 4% deals are automatic tax credit deals. They usually require a little more funding from the different capital stack sources. And the 9% deals provide greater funding, but are also done on a lottery basis. So they're not automatic as the 4% deals are. So it's harder to entitle property in a 9% basis because you don't want to tie up property for a long time while you're in a lottery system that you may or may not win. Obviously we've done a variety of things in terms of our home programs and our federal funds to try to create affordable housing beyond those programs because we want to do that. And we've also tried to be flexible and creative in terms of some of our initiatives to support, as you said, workforce housing and affordable housing through sort of non-traditional ways, like through our zoning code, through waiver of permits and fees. So we've tried to be as innovative as possible, always trying to figure out ways to support the affordable housing community, which is frankly probably the number one issue in Miami.
So I am curious, since you have such a depth of knowledge on this topic, did you know a lot about this before you became mayor, or was this something, it's just such an issue in Miami that it was imperative to learn more about it?
Well, before I was mayor, I was a councilman for 8 years. And so what happened is in 2009, and my father was mayor in the 80s, and my father always talked about and was always proud of the number of affordable housing units that were built during his tenure. So as a young person at the dinner table, I heard that over and over and over again. I think that's where that healthy obsession came from. And then, when you get older and you realize that housing costs are the number one expense in a household, in a family, you understand how important it is to help people live in a way that allows them to be successful in a challenging modern day world. And so as government, you want to try to find ways to be helpful and be effective. And that's not always an easy thing, particularly when it kind of goes outside of your competency scope in terms of, we police our streets, we have police officers, we have firefighters, we know how to handle those things. We have people that pick up your garbage, we know how to do that. But building affordable housing was not something that cities and counties, I think, had a track record of doing in a way that was, I'm going to be very careful with the words that I choose here because I don't want to throw anybody under the proverbial bus. But I think the product that you're seeing today is a product that lasts longer, that's a little bit more innovative, that is, because of that private sector involvement, is better leveraged and it's better maintained.
Yeah, very good. And I think our audience will notice too the beautiful background behind you, and there's no kind of better example of what you're talking about, the fact that there's a building crane moving around right behind you there.
It's amazing. It's not virtual, and you got the palm trees flying and the crane going, and so it's certainly a function of the activity that's happening in our city.
Yeah. So my next question is, we want to hear if you have a specific example of how your city is building towards a more resilient, affordable housing future. And in particular, we recently read about Miami's progressive take on cryptocurrency and its fit with affordable housing, and would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I'd say on the first question, one of the things we've done is an anti-climate gentrification fund. I think it's first of its kind probably in the country. And what we did was we created a home retrofit program where people could get funding through our Miami Forever bond program to retrofit their homes to make them more resilient, whether it's windows, roofs, et cetera. And then they're prohibited from selling the home for a period of time because we don't want, again, gentrification. We're not trying to give people grant money for them to improve the house and flip the house and make money. What we want is to maintain neighborhood identity, maintain neighborhoods in the ethnic composition that they've traditionally been, to the extent that we can. And it's been very, very successful. It's probably first of its kind in the country. So, we are innovative when it comes to that approach, and we try to do everything that we can to look at affordable housing from a different perspective and not sort of the traditional ways all the time.
And so specifically, can you tell us a little bit more about where cryptocurrency can potentially fit into all of this?
Sorry, I forgot the question number two.
Yeah.
I think crypto is a democratizing technology, right? And so I think, one of the problems that we see in today's day and age is number one, most people have their bank account, their money's in a bank account, and that is not earning any interest. So they are essentially losing money by having money in a bank account because of inflation. The value of their dollar diminishes over time. And so that's why there's these divides, right, where you see sort of the rich get richer and the poor get poor, because they don't have the same investment opportunities that we see. Cryptocurrency has democratized those opportunities in terms of allowing people to invest in a variety of those technologies. It's also going to democratize investment opportunities from the perspective of tokenizing some of these projects and giving people the opportunity to get higher yields than they would get ordinarily. So I'm excited to see how it interplays with affordable housing in particular, because I think, there's some interesting use cases, not just in crypto, but also in blockchain that could be interesting in the future.
Right. And so we've covered both the public sector solutions and some private sector. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because we found from the survey that I mentioned, respondents were saying that they do believe that there are two types of ways or two types of programs that will help to shore up vulnerable, affordable rental housing. And one is on this, what we could call renter directed programs like vouchers and changing income thresholds for those who are eligible, things like that. And then the supply side approaches that are zoning changes, tax abatements, developer fee relief. And would love to know a little bit more about how you balance both types in Miami.
Well, we want both, right? So we want the voucher program to grow. We want it to grow in terms of the eligibility, and we want it to grow in terms of the size. In terms of a zoning change approach, it's exactly what I did in 2009 when I got here. I literally wanted to build affordable housing. We were broke, the city was broke. We were on the verge of the mortgage meltdown. And I said to my team, I said, I want to build affordable housing. They said, we don't have any money. I said, well, we're going to have to find a way to do it. And what we did was we redesigned through the zoning code. We looked at the 9% deals I was talking about earlier, those lottery deals, and we actually reverse engineered the scoring system. And we used our zoning code to maximize the points that a developer could get by applying under that system. And so we got in 1 year every single 9% deal in the entire state of Florida, in Miami, in the city of Miami. So the legislature very quickly changed the way these lottery deals were dispersed, and actually went to a zone concept where they did, a certain amount in the Miami-Dade zone, a certain amount in the Orlando zone, a certain amount in the Tampa zone, a certain amount in the Jacksonville. But that's because of our use of the zoning code as a means of being innovative, right? In a way that allowed us to get, I think it was 1,500 units in 1 year. But the other thing that we've done with something like Miami Coin, to go back to sort of your crypto question, was, Miami Coin is something that is a cryptocurrency that is generating a percentage of the benefit from mining that would otherwise go to the miners, and it's separating it into a digital wallet that cities like Miami can access. And in just under 60 days, it's already generated about $7.5 million for the city. Wow. Stuff that can be used for anything, including affordable housing. And I think that's something that would be an amazing new revenue source to continue to build affordable housing in a city that so desperately needs it.
Right. Yeah, we may see cities and counties hiring people who are experts in cryptocurrency to begin to find these new streams of revenue, which would be very interesting to see.
Very true.
Yeah. So another thing that's certainly been a hot topic over the last couple of years, and as the pandemic has gone on, is around racial and ethnic disparities and the issues that really need to be addressed after a long time of not being addressed. And so we're wondering, can you offer any recommendations for how cities can improve racial disparities in housing after years of inequities?
Well, I think the first thing is cities have to, analyze and get data on exactly what's happening, and certainly acknowledge that could exist and likely may exist in a city. Quantify it, and then find ways to address it. It's hard to do because it's hard to do things based on race, but you're able to do things based on income levels, based on poverty levels. And that sometimes inordinately will benefit a particular race or another race. And I think that's a way of doing it in a more objective standard. We have that challenge of waking up every morning, looking at ourselves in the mirror and wondering whether we're doing the very best that we can, the most that we can to create a world that is fair.
Absolutely. And I think we've all seen in the headlines over the last few months just the incredible amount of growth that Florida generally, but Miami in particular. So what is next for Miami in terms of how you're going to be viewing affordable housing in the long term?
Well, affordable housing is going to be a big component of what we emphasize. We're trying to leverage every single dollar to get the maximum private sector contribution. I think in our Miami Forever affordable housing piece, we're getting about a 20 to 1, 25 to 1 leverage rate, which means for every dollar we're investing, we're getting 20 private sector dollars. So $200 million of projects for $10 million. And that's important because we want to maximize the opportunities. And we're going to work with partners like Miami-Dade County and other people who have different components of what makes affordable housing doable in our city to maximize our opportunities. We feel very bullish that we can keep Miami affordable because we have supply. Whereas other cities are supply constrained, we have a 10x multiple in terms of the delta between what can be built and what is built. And we also have funds, which is usually the biggest impediment for people. And so we just have to be smart about how we deploy them.
Right. And what advice would you have for a city or a county that's looking to examine and do a better job with how you can house your workforce in high cost areas? I mean, I imagine there's not sort of a silver bullet to that.
No, there isn't, but I would say a few things. There's one is you need to look at your zoning code and make sure you have capacity, right? And that can be thorny and difficult because obviously there's sometimes people don't want to expand capacity in given cities. I think you should look at best practices. Rely on organizations like the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Obviously, I'm the vice president of that organization, and I'm going to be the president hopefully in January. And we pride ourselves on creating best practice models that other cities can follow. Sometimes the biggest or the best innovations come from some of the smallest cities. People think that it's always the big cities that are creating all these innovations. Some of the smartest elected officials I've ever met are from tiny cities that you may not even have heard of, and they're brilliant people. So, you can find some really, really special things in small places.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Mayor Suarez. It's been wonderful to speak with you and learn a little bit more about what's going on in Miami. We wish you all the best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to present the NHPF Affordable Housing Advocacy Award to an individual who exhibits unflagging support for the efforts it takes to create and preserve affordable housing. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Houston is an outstanding example of this support. Through both our own personal experience creating housing alongside the representative or marveling at her skill on many other projects, we couldn't find a more deserving recipient of this year's award. Thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee.
Greetings, I'm Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And may I say something to NHP and all those who gathered. If there's ever a time that you are needed to help America and to help us promote affordable, sustainable housing for all those that are unhoused, it is now. That is why I'm so honored, so humbled to receive your Affordable Housing Award, emphasizing my commitment over 30 years plus in working on housing in the nation and in my community of Houston, Texas. I started as a member of the Houston City Council, going to many of the housing developments to work with those who live there to say this is our home and it deserves to be beautiful and safe. Thank you again for realizing how desperately today we need affordable housing, how many persons are unhoused, and how many people are homeless. We know that in the pandemic, so many people suffered with unnecessary evictions. The fight we had in Washington, as that was one of the issues that I worked on extensively, to continue an eviction moratorium, to ensure that federal funds were getting to those who are desperately in need. We know in a 2018 report how desperate people can become without housing. And we realize that someone making the minimum wage, working for 40 hours, could not even afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Thank you for focusing on multifamily units and recognizing that they can be sustainable, they can create flourishing communities, and that we can, as a nation, reject the idea of people being unhoused as normal. And we can say that families count, children count, seniors count, and how important it is for them to have the right kind of housing. I've always said that a student who has their own room, their own desk at their room, their own bed, is a student that flourishes and really does well in school. There's so much to housing, so much dignity that is brought about, and so much that gives life to a community and a family. I know that in working with you in Clemmy Manor and working with you in Pepper Tree. Those were among many other opportunities to work for people who needed housing, were exciting moments. I've even worked with the Houston Housing Authority on public housing or housing developments to ensure people have ability to live. But it is important that we have affordable housing for low and moderate income families that are struggling every day to be able to teach their children right from wrong and to be able to give them a place that causes them to be the right place. I thank you for allowing me to do this moment this evening and to share with you my thoughts and my passion. You know, I have known, or did know, John Robert Lewis for 27 years as a member of the United States Congress. And everyone knows his history as he walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He walked for voting rights. But in walking for voting rights, John stood up for many rights, the dignity of people. NHP, you stand for the dignity of people. That's why I'm so very excited to be able to receive this award from you tonight. I am honored, so honored. And what it does is allows me to be able to keep on keeping on. John Lewis said, carry on. NHP, you carry on, and we will carry on together. Thank you so very, very much. I am humbled.
Hi, everyone. How good was it to hear from Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, a veteran and a visionary for the cause of providing affordable housing in her district, as well as advocating for it beyond her hometown. So thank you, Representative Jackson Lee. My name is Laura DiMaria, and I will be your moderator this evening. Our next conversation with some of affordable housing's most notable experts from the academic and policy world will bring into even sharper focus what prescriptive measures we should all consider in safeguarding the resource that is affordable housing. Our experts will discuss the effectiveness of various housing programs across the major political and economic events of the last decade, as well as look ahead to where we could go to ensure fair and accessible housing for all. We hope to touch on some of the themes of the survey, including the Great Recession and its aftermath, rebuilding in a divided U.S., and the need for further work on equal access in housing. Please join me in welcoming our participants in the Policy Influencers and Academics conversation. First is Emily Kotick, the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, AHTCC, where she tirelessly leads advocacy efforts to support affordable rental housing financed using the LIHTC program. Emily's work on the Hill has helped create and pass key housing legislation. Next, we have Ingrid Gold-Ellen. Ingrid is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and Director for the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. She presently teaches courses in microeconomics, urban economics, and urban policy research. Professor Ellen's research interests center on housing and urban policy, and she recently edited The Dream Revisited: Contemporary Debates About Housing, Segregation, and Opportunity. So welcome, Ingrid. Please also welcome Neil McCullough, the Executive Director of the Corcoran Center for Real Estate and Urban Action at Boston College. 2 years ago, the center introduced a different kind of business case competition for undergraduate students at Boston College, focused on who could come up with the best plans for much-needed affordable housing. Now, the Corcoran Center is expanding the competition to include students at other colleges and universities, with key help from corporate and individual supporters. As Executive Director, Neil McCullough is responsible for this and other creative ways to drive innovation and entrepreneurship in affordable housing. Our fourth panelist is Jenny Schutz, Senior Fellow, Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Jenny is a nationally recognized expert in urban economics and housing policy. She has written numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change, and is published everywhere from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vox. So welcome, Jenny. And thank you all for being here. We're glad to have you and looking forward to this conversation. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to introduce into this discussion is the name of this event is A Decade of Rental Housing Vulnerability, Lessons Learned from Financial Crisis to Coronavirus. So a decade of rental housing vulnerability. Reflecting on this theme, we wonder, how has affordable housing production performed during economic downturns in the past, thinking across this span of time? And I want to open that question up to anyone on the panel who would like to discuss how it's changed.
I may just jump in and start and just say, I mean, I think it's obvious that needs actually grow during economic downturn. Let's just say the need for affordable housing only grows as rents tend not to fall at the low end during downturns, but incomes fall. And so affordability burdens really, households get squeezed. But if anything, our current affordable housing production system actually produces less affordable housing, if anything, during economic downturns. It has the potential to do so, largely because on the one hand, private lenders tend to tighten underwriting and cut back on lending to any projects, including affordable housing during economic downturns. And in addition, the low-income housing tax credit, which is the primary source of subsidy for new affordable housing developments, also tends to see reduced demand during economic downturns because the corporations, the banks and financial institutions that purchase credits they cut back. They're going to reduce their demand when they anticipate fewer profits, that less taxable income that they need to offset. And indeed, during what happened during the Great Recession is the demand for the tax credit actually plummeted enough so that the price of the credits fell to about 60 cents on the dollar, and that ended up being a huge problem for a lot of developments that had been underwritten, assuming a 90 cent per dollar cost, and so there were sort of huge funding gaps. A lot of projects got stalled. And then tighter underwriting also just compounded the problem. And we haven't seen, I should say that we haven't seen the same kind of, I think, reduction in demand for tax credits during this downturn, largely because we sort of haven't seen the same hit to the financial sector. So it depends on the type of downturn. But I think it is important to understand that vulnerability. And I mean, I can talk now a little bit, Laura. I don't know whether sort of about the response. I mean, one of the things that came up in the Housing Vulnerability Survey was a lot of people applauded the tax credit exchange program as being really critical in keeping capital flowing to affordable housing and keeping those tax credit developments going. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think that was successful. I think that it supported over 900 LIHTC deals, the tax credit exchange program, which included over 70,000 housing units. So and I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards.
Yeah, and I would also just offer one point on that, which is a big part of the crash during the Great Recession in the LIHTC market was that Fannie and Freddie had previously made up 35 to 40% of the market and got out completely, which left a huge hole in just the number of investors and the amount of equity going into the market. Whereas one thing that's very different this time is not only did Fannie and Freddie start at a lower level of the market ever since they've re-entered, they've been capped at $500 million each. But the administration just recently announced that they are going to be increasing their share of the LIHTC market, partly to help offset some of the dips in pricing that we've seen and help play a more appropriate counter-cyclical role. So there's some very different features this time around, and I think we have learned some lesson about the public role and the public-private partnership with the credit, and it does seem that being able to adjust that lever in a more positive way is helping to sustain and improve the market rather than the sort of catastrophic effect that it had last time around.
And I'll just jump in with 2 points. One is that outside of the tax credit and sort of the federally subsidized housing, an increasing number of local governments are relying on inclusionary zoning programs to generate housing. And those are designed to be pro-cyclical. So inclusionary zoning, when the market rate housing gets built, some portion of those units get set aside for low-income households, which means that when the market rate development collapses, there's no affordable housing that gets generated. So that's just one of the inherent weaknesses of inclusionary zoning. The other point is, I think, a little bit more abstract from the financing mechanisms, which is just to point out that the time that it takes to do a development project, particularly a big development project, and especially in large urban areas, just gets longer and longer. So it's not that unusual for it to take between 7 and 10 years for a project to go from start to completion, buying the land, getting the entitlements, lining up all of the financing sources, going through the entitlement process, and then construction and lease up. That makes it really hard to time when the units will come online. And so projects may be coming online when demand is softening and they're not getting the rents that they need on the market rate units to cross-subsidize. It's very difficult to know that units will come online when we have more demand for them. So I think shrinking the time cycle just to get development done would be helpful.
So I'm curious to ask a question of Ingrid and Jenny. Do you feel like the Great Recession actually produced some of these innovations that have contributed to, as you call them, counter-cyclical programs that have smoothed out the demand for affordable housing?
I'm not sure whether, I think there was some, what I would say about, for instance, the tax credit exchange program, which I think was a really innovative idea. And it basically allowed, I'm sure everybody, all the audience knows, but it basically allowed state allocating agencies to sort of exchange unused or return credits at 85 cents on the dollar for just a direct cash grant from Treasury, because when the market just sort of fell out of the tax credit program, and it ended up being sort of a fiscally neutral price, so that it didn't sort of cost the federal government. It wasn't an additional appropriation. But the issue with that was that it was temporary. And it required congressional action. And what I would love to see going forward is that exchange program actually just being automatic and sort of having some kind of set price that's kind of at some fiscally neutral, kind of below the market, and so that when the market really tanks, that exchange option would automatically be available. But so I think a lot of what I would love to see is just sort of more automatic stabilizers in the market. I think politically we did a lot, but it takes, as Emily knows, better than anybody here on this call, right? It takes a lot to sort of move Congress to action, and I think I think we've seen a lot of really some terrific innovations, but none of them have been kind of permanent or made automatic.
And the other way that you could imagine that working is to have additional allocations of vouchers or emergency rental assistance programs that are directly tied to some sort of macroeconomic indicator, including at the local level, right? So a state unemployment rate could be tied to releasing an additional allocation of vouchers, right? And that's actually a much quicker way to help low-income households than trying to assemble a land and assemble financing and build something from scratch. Just give people money and they can go rent apartments. And if that support were tied to some sort of an automatic stabilizer, so Congress didn't have to go through the authorization, it could kick in much faster.
That's right. And maybe not have to set up 500 state and local programs across the country as well. So maybe we could just have a standing federal, but I'm digressing.
The only thing I'll add, just from the kind of the advocate side here, is anything that's automatic sounds great to us, because when there are these downturns, obviously, we're all housers, so we think about it through the housing lens and what is needed. But when we approach Congress with what we think the emergency measures that we need are, they're also often trying to bail out an auto industry or an airline industry, or respond to a novel virus. And there's so many other pressing concerns before policymakers that even the people who are the housing advocates are often pulled in so many directions. So the idea of something that we don't have to go back and ask for in the middle of that is a dream for us. And one example is tax credits after natural disasters, where we used to routinely see, there were the GO zone credits and after every major storm. But then when Congress didn't do it after Sandy, it's been it really kind of broke what was pretty automatic. And now it is a fight every time. So I know there's proposals out there to also make it automatic to get an additional allocation of credits. And there's just so many fights in Congress that could be avoided. It really shouldn't matter what the political makeup is or what the moving legislative vehicles are when there's a storm or a crisis that needs responding to.
So thank you for all of those responses. And I feel like we're segueing very well into our next question. We're kind of even already beginning to answer it a little bit. But so, we're hearing a lot about what the emergency response has been over the last year plus and how there have been these historic investments in housing, and including in potential legislation, coming down the pipeline. So the question is, where does the affordable housing community go from here? And how do we maintain this level of support for affordable housing? How do we make any of these innovations or investments permanent? And it sounds like we already know that some of the things that were innovations or new things from the Great Recession maybe don't exist now. So how do we build the political will for that? What's the way forward? How could you involve even local governments or new partners in that?
Yeah, so I can kick us off. I think one of the things that's really remarkable about the moment that we're in right now is that there is not a question of if we are going to include housing as part of the response, both to the pandemic, but also as we're rebuilding longer term and thinking about our nation's infrastructure, but that it's really how much. And when I say how much, I mean how many potentially tens, hundreds of billions of dollars are going to be allocated to different affordable housing programs. So whereas a lot of us in the housing community spent a lot of years trying to make the case that housing is infrastructure and here's why, and maybe you don't think of housing as infrastructure, but you really should because of the jobs it creates and the lasting community asset. We are at this point, I would say, not even at a point where we need to continue making that case. The case has been made, and it's really just at a point of figuring out what level of investment is going to be made in housing. So it's really remarkable. And I think, one of the sad realities of the pandemic is everyone did understand probably more than ever how important it is to have a home and a home that you can afford and that's safe and not overcrowded. So, I think where we go from here is going to be making it so that policymakers do continue to think about housing as part of their response anytime we are no matter what the cause of the downturn is, that housing has to be a part of it. So I think, going back to Congress, even after this whole infrastructure legislative push is over, making sure that everything remains bipartisan, even though a lot of these housing investments may be made on a party line basis, and making sure that we just keep up that momentum. I think it is on all of us that we made the case really successfully this time. But we have to continue making it. We can't take anything for granted in the policy world.
I think one other lesson that we should try to build on is sharing information better between local governments and probably also between local and federal partners. So we've certainly seen with the emergency rental assistance that every city, every state is standing up its own program. They're all running into similar difficulties, and there wasn't really a centralized place to kind of share information on what worked and what didn't. And so we should get better about doing that, not in times of crisis, build some of the infrastructure we need, the communications infrastructure. I think also we need to remember that local governments differ enormously in their capacity. So there's a tendency for some of the federal programs to be designed with big cities in mind, thinking about places like New York and LA that have 400 people in their housing department and can stand up a complicated program and have capacity. I think we've not thought enough about how do you get housing assistance to places that are smaller, that have fewer staff, that maybe don't have experience running these programs. And that's the kind of thing that ideally we'd be doing not during a crisis. So when the crisis hits, we already have some pipelines and some mechanisms to get assistance out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jenny. And I think that I do hope that we will learn, that we will build on the lessons that we've learned from the emergency rental assistance experience. We have over 500 state and local programs across the country. These public officials have just worked around the clock to set up these programs, and I think it really would be a shame if they just sort of disappeared and we forgot all that until the next crisis. I mean, my preference again would be to have sort of a standing federal emergency rental assistance program that was automatic and that we didn't have to do this again. But I think that, the local infrastructure that we've built, I think can be very useful going forward. I think one of the things of course, Jenny and I will talk about the need for data, but it turned out a big part of a big stumbling block for these programs has been the ability to sort of coordinate and match tenants and their landlords. And so the need for better data on rental housing I think has really been underscored.
Yeah, to follow up quickly on Emily and Jenny's point, it is housing has become a priority, and people are much better educated about it. But to make these issues a priority in the future, we have to link housing to all of the other major trends that are happening, whether it's inequality or social inequality, the race relations in the U.S. Housing is a keystone issue that is related to all of these different trends in the United States. And the more that we can talk to the general public about this and realize that housing is not just an economic lever, but rather an issue that we all need to deal with year-round, recession to recession, the better off we'll all be.
And Neil, I just want to add on, I couldn't agree more, but I think climate change is another one.
Of course, climate change, yeah.
So Ingrid, you alluded to some work maybe that you and Jenny have done together. So I want to talk about that real quick. So my question for both of you, and of course, Neil and Emily, join in if you'd like as well. So the question is, what do we do to increase the stock of long-term affordable rental housing, especially in high opportunity communities through acquisition?
I can start with the piece and you can jump in and fill in the New York examples. Yeah, so part of the idea about focusing a little bit more on acquisition and not purely on new development gets back to this issue of how long it takes to get new housing online. So development is slow, it takes a long time, you go through a lot of obstacles. Acquisition is potentially a way to get new units in the affordable housing stock faster, particularly when we have these sort of crises and need to build it up. So the idea would be to find probably older apartment buildings, either that are facing some financial difficulty or that potentially might become attractive to investors and could slip out of the affordable housing stock in that direction, but to provide either local governments or nonprofit partners with the funds to be able to acquire those properties, do rehab if necessary in order to keep them habitable, and then put long-term affordability restrictions on them. So one of the innovations we saw coming out of the Great Recession was the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which was at that time a pretty substantial amount of money delivered to local governments and to nonprofit partners to acquire initially single-family properties that were going through foreclosure, but it expanded to cover multifamily rental properties as well. And that was sort of a new thing, to provide them with money, allow them to buy this and put it into the long-term affordable stock. One of the nice things also about acquisition is that it's maybe possible to get affordable rental housing in some of the really high opportunity neighborhoods, job-rich communities, transit-rich communities, places that have good schools and parks, lower rates of health hazards, places where it's impossible to get through the community process to build affordable housing from ground up. But if there are existing apartment buildings that you can purchase, that's just a fantastic opportunity to get people into those neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I would add, I think when we wrote our piece, or maybe we wrote two, Jenny, I think they were for Brookings. So that, at that point, prices were falling, and we thought that prices would fall more on the residential market, right? They actually, right, they're generally haven't fallen now. They're quite inflated, but I still think that. So I just want to add that I think there's also an opportunity for conversions of commercial space as well. With hotels, a lot of people are talking about, especially residential hotels, sort of longer term stay hotels, but also some, office space, other kind of commercial space. I mean, sometimes the design, the sort of floor plan makes it difficult because, there's a lot of internal space without windows, but in many cases it really can work. And I think it's not free, but it will be, you do have sometimes those conversions can be expensive, but I think to Jenny's point, I just want to underscore kind of the political, the lower political hurdles in doing so, even when you're talking about commercial buildings right, they already exist. And so, and I think, and that's a huge part of the cost of building affordable housing is sort of getting through the community. And once you have a structure that's already there, sort of all of the design concerns, the air and light and views, and are going to be mitigated considerably. So I think that there is an opportunity and an important opportunity.
And I would say from Ingrid's work in New York, one of the things that we've learned is the way you finance these deals is pretty important, right? So ideally, you'd be able to use the public capital as sort of the equity piece and then leverage it, borrow against that with some private debt to expand the capacity of the project. But also to have a fund that's relatively nimble that can go in. So if you're trying to acquire an existing property and you're potentially bidding against other investors, going through a long procurement process, for instance, or having to have access to the building to do extensive inspections makes the public entities sometimes non-competitive. So this is a place where we have some good examples, and being able to sort of build on those and share knowledge about ways to structure the financing, the kinds of legal entities that can do this stuff competitively, the kinds of entities that have property management experience so that they can take over and rent it. That's something that not every local government is going to want to do, but sharing some knowledge on what's worked before could make this a more scalable option.
Thank you both. And Ingrid, you mentioned a couple of papers. Do you have top of mind what are the name of those if anyone wants to go and access them?
One, I think, was strategies for increasing affordable housing amid the COVID-19 economic crisis. I think that's right. I don't remember the second one, Jenny, but and then what we also had, the argument for the sort of as automatic stabilizers in the housing market, and standing emergency rental assistance came in published in a Hamilton Project paper for the Brookings Institution. And I think it was something like introducing automatic stabilizers into housing.
I don't remember the titles, but they should be search engine optimized. So if you Google affordable housing acquisition downturn, that'll take you to the right place.
Great, thank you. Okay, good. So something that came up a couple of comments ago was around racial equity. And so I do want to bring that back up into the discussion. So we've mentioned this survey that NHP Foundation has been putting out, the Housing Vulnerability Survey. And there are several things that rise to the surface in terms of areas that are being identified as essentially areas that need attention, right? And this is one of those. So there's this agreement that further progress needs to be made in addressing long-term racial discrimination. And we've identified a few areas where that happens, including real estate and lending practices and federal housing policy. So my question for all of you is, how can practitioners address this issue going forward, especially as we're thinking about lessons learned, how to move forward into the future? What can practitioners do?
I'd like to talk about this a little bit because we come in contact with so many companies that are faced with this challenge, and I would say the first thing that practitioners need to do is to take it on board that this is a priority, and it's going to take sustained effort and persistence. So the hiring and advancing of people of color into positions across the spectrum within real estate, as you mentioned, in lending, in particular, lending, in real estate, in finance, all of these positions will contribute in the long run to the opportunity of more people to take advantage of working with people that are like themselves. And see opportunity within an organization to advance. The other thing that I would say that's really critical, and we're seeing, is mentorship. We don't often people talk a lot about hiring and advancing people, but mentorship is a critical component. We see this in our own work in our internship program, where we can find positions and organizations with a student a person of color who is a student and wants to advance into that field, having a personal mentor in that field that can help that student navigate and see the entire field and the opportunities within it really changes the game for that student and opens up that opportunity, whether it's in finance or real estate or law, and it becomes a realistic pathway for that student.
I'll take it in a slightly different direction and say that particularly when it comes to closing the racial wealth gap and gaps in homeownership rates, a lot of this really comes back to a difference in family resources and family wealth, right? So we know that Black households in particular, Latino households, have been excluded from building up wealth over generations because they were previously excluded from being homeowners or essentially could only buy in neighborhoods that didn't appreciate as much. And so I think at some point we just have to grapple with the way to fix that is to do a lump sum transfer of wealth from households who have wealth to households who don't. And so something like baby bonds that Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity have written about, would be a way to provide seed capital to families, at the time that kids are born, and allow them to have that wealth to tap into as an adult, either to buy a home or to start a business or to go to college. That's getting outside of, strictly speaking, the housing policy. But at some point, the way to get over the racial gap in wealth is to redistribute wealth. I think it's time to talk about this stuff seriously.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Jenny. I will, though, return to sort of what we could do kind of in the housing world incrementally. I think it's also important to have that conversation. And I think one of the things that I'd love to see affordable housing developers and managers focus a little bit more on is affirmative marketing and search. And one of the things that we found in our research at the Furman Center is that we have some examples now of tax credit developments that get built in higher opportunity neighborhoods and resource-rich neighborhoods, but often the families that move into those developments are actually more advantaged often and whiter than the families that move into the tax credit developments in lower income neighborhoods. So it's not enough to sort of just we can't just declare victory by it's sort of necessary but not sufficient to build affordable housing in resource-rich neighborhoods. I think we really also have to pay attention to our outreach, our marketing efforts, our screening practices, and work hard to ensure and frankly invest in search infrastructure to help families who are looking for affordable housing to sort of open up their horizons. There's a wonderful new tool that has been launched in Massachusetts, I think, Housing Navigator, that actually allows someone searching in the state of Massachusetts to basically see kind of every available affordable housing unit in the entire state. Like, that's wonderful. And I think we need to invest in more tools like that.
Yeah, I think all of these responses show just how much, as with all of these all difficult issues, there's not one answer. It's addressing both the people who work in affordable housing and trying to bring in a more diverse pipeline of people to help finance and develop affordable housing. It's making sure that we remove barriers and discriminatory practices in lending. With the housing credit specifically, which is of course the area that I'm focused on, Ingrid mentioned a couple ways that we are trying to move more housing credit developments into the higher opportunity areas. We just saw a major proposal from the Biden administration as part of the Build Back Better plan to try to steer housing credits to opportunity to the highest opportunity areas. And while that specific proposal may not be what makes it across the finish line, there's a number of other proposals the industry has put forward, like lifting the cap on the high opportunity areas that can get financing boosts to build there. Also, not just building more in high opportunity areas, but being more thoughtful about when the investments are made in neighborhoods that are still being revitalized. So there's proposals that the affordable housing industry has put forward to try to make sure that when we are building in higher poverty areas, that it's part of a concerted community revitalization plan. And while that's already been required, trying to put a little more meat onto what that is. So I think it's great to see how much everyone in the industry is focused on these issues now. And there's a lot of really good ideas that are starting to bubble up. And it's great to have venues like these and others where I think a lot of these practices are hopefully going to be spreading much more quickly over the following years, both in terms of what individual companies do, but also where we build housing and who lives in it.
Thank you. So I am thinking about something based on a few of the comments that you all have made. And again, going back to the NHPF Affordable Housing Vulnerability Survey. So one of the things that respondents were asked about is the idea of housing as a human right. And most respondents, unsurprisingly for the audience that's taking this, they overwhelmingly felt that housing is a human right and that there is not enough support in the public sector to support affordable rental housing. So that's one thought. Housing is a human right. Going back, Emily, to what you said around the case has been made around how important housing is generally and how that case was made during this last period of time. And in particular, how important housing is, just in this particular crisis. So I'm wondering, are we at the point where can we say that housing is viewed broadly as a human right? And if it isn't, will that be a beneficial advance in this conversation when we do this 10 years from now? Is it going to be like, hey, we're all on the same page now, this is great? Is that in our future? Is that a possibility? And how do we get there? Like, what is the messaging that can be done to make it clear that housing is a human right?
Well, I would say we are ways off from a universal acceptance that housing is a human right. I think we have a lot more housing champions than we used to. We've got members of Congress fighting over how they can support different housing programs the most, which I love. But I think what we've really done successfully is make the case that housing is important, that you need housing during an emergency. And I go a step farther and say I think we made the case, at least to the Democrats currently looking at this kind of human infrastructure bill, that housing is part of infrastructure. I think when we saw some of the proposals come out from the administration and Congress, we were able to kind of set aside some of those, fact sheets we all made about, trying to make the case housing is infrastructure. No one's asking for that anymore. It's really just how are we going to, which programs are vetted, are ready to go? Can we, start building the fastest, basically? But that is a very specific political moment we're in, and a moment as a country having come out from a year and a half where people spent it at home. I wouldn't take for granted that sentiment is going to persist depending on how political tides may change and what happens with the economy. So while I do think that you do start hearing that more, that housing is a right, I still think that we have a long way to go, and we should just kind of keep building on what we've done, because it has worked to an extent, but we're a long way. We have a long ways to go. I mean, we're still at, 1 in 5 people eligible for housing assistance receive it, and got 11 million household shortage. And I'm citing old data because I don't think we even have what the impact of the pandemic has been. So I will just share a quick story before I turn it over to others. I remember one time, I know we all have trouble explaining what we do in affordable housing to friends and family, but one time I was trying to explain to someone who lives in Norway that we advocate for affordable housing, and we were having this real disconnect over, what it was that I do, and I learned throughout the conversation that they don't have any people who don't have. It is a human right there, and everybody, basically, if anyone is not housed, it is because they've kind of chosen that path. I don't want to oversimplify it, and I'll let others correct me, but the concept that there's this shortage of affordable housing just doesn't exist in a lot of places, and I think we have a long way to go before we get there.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. I think we do have a lot to learn from other countries that approach this issue really differently. So I actually partnered with a bunch of people who work in housing in other countries earlier this year, and we wrote a series of case studies on rental housing specifically in 6 developed countries. And the US stands out as sort of the stingiest in the sense that we spend the least amount of GDP on housing compared to other rich countries. And also that we don't provide housing assistance as an entitlement the way we do with other kinds of programs. So I think some of this is, that housing as a human right, I think is a little bit abstract for some people. Something like every family that qualifies for food stamps gets it automatically and doesn't have to wait for Congress to increase the budget. Every family that qualifies for Medicaid gets it automatically. There isn't a budget cap on that. Housing assistance doesn't work the same way. So even with within the context of social insurance programs in the US, housing assistance is treated differently. And so I think that's one way to explain to people what's wrong with the way we deal with it now.
I think I would make it even less abstract. I think one of the things that I thought was really exceptional or interesting over the last 7 or 8 years is how the work around social determinants of health has actually kind of seeped its way into the general discussion, and I think it's important to start talking about housing in that way. And the more you hear about housing as it relates to health outcomes, as it relates to access to education, and how housing contributes to better access to opportunity, then it becomes an economic outcome rather than, as I mentioned before, rather than the economic lever, it becomes something that produces the economic outcomes that we want to see in our towns and cities. But I think making it less abstract and generalizing the conversation around housing more will help affordable housing become more in line with what we see in these countries with super high quality of life like Denmark, Norway, Sweden.
Yeah, no, I just, I don't have, I would just add sort of one additional component to this conversation, which is that, and I think Jenny brought this up earlier, is that there's not only sort of that, we have a system in which maybe 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 eligible low-income renters actually receives assistance, but even those that do have to wait years in most places to get it. And so you do have this serious time lag between the moment when people actually need the help and the time when they're able to get it. So that's another really sort of cruel and I think really concrete failure and easy to understand failure of our system.
So we've been thinking about all of these issues in the context of the last 10 years. And of course, we also want to look forward as well. We've got a couple professors on our panel, a couple of academics. So I've a question that's specifically for both of you, but anybody, again, feel free to answer. So as we're thinking forward and ahead, I'm wondering how are educators now changing their tactics to prepare students to work in the field of affordable housing?
Well, thank you for the question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about students, which I love. I think we're in a really interesting time for students right now. We have a group of a cohort of students coming up that are completely digital natives. They walk around with all the information of the world in their pocket, and they're very deeply connected with wanting to do something have some sort of a social impact. And so we see students that are starting to identify, rather than career paths, that they identify with what they want to do by the world that they want to have impact on. I want to work in climate change, or I want to work on immigration rights, or I want to work in affordable housing. And so as we are running a real estate program that's trying to prepare people for the field of real estate, we chose early on, because of the DNA of our organization is we were founded by a mixed income developer, a multifamily developer. And he wanted to see people thinking about affordable housing regardless of which path they went on in real estate. So one of the things that we've done is we've tried to integrate a lot of very practical learning into our program. Almost every class that we teach has some sort of a practical element of it. They come and they engage with professionals. And so we have people from the affordable housing sector, was nonprofit developers, for-profit developers coming in and sharing their experience with students and having students work on real projects. And this is one of the things that I think is really changing the game for the students in our program. And again, to put in a plug for the Urban Land Institute, they have a great simulation called Urban Plan, which is we've adopted as part of our curriculum, and it's a great program. It ties the knowledge, skill, and experience that students are gaining by reading, in lectures, and then applying it. And this is one of the primary things that we think is really changing the game for students. And then on a programming level, again, we've tried very hard to engage the real world in our program. You mentioned in the introduction our case competition, but now we're in the third year of our fourth year of our case competition, and we've moved it out from a local program to inviting 45 schools across the country to this program. And what makes it interesting is that we challenge them with a real case, but we don't have just one little experience for them. We do workshops, one workshop and then a second workshop that really explains the low-income housing tax credit program, and it explains affordable housing, has them learn how to underwrite a deal, and then they go off and work on a case. It gives them practical experience. It shows them that these things require different disciplines from different sectors. You need to be working with finance. You need to be working with government, and that these two entities, government and the private sector, can work effectively to create positive, high impact housing solutions. So, one of the key things is practice, right? We want our students to be learning how to use the skills that they glean in the classroom. And then through this, we hope that we're minting a new generation of affordable housing developers that are, willing to fight for policies that are going to be doing more than just building a box, that are going to be going out and doing something for the common good. It's an exciting time to be a student, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about these complex issues. And our program tries to give them a way to practice what they learn in the classroom.
That's great, Neil. I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that you said. I think that, and I will start by saying, I do think that students are, because I teach in a graduate school of public service, so I obviously see a set of students who are already, motivated to really change the world. But I think you even see that more today than you did, and I think there are a lot of young people who feel like they really are motivated by making a difference in the world, and that's wonderful to see. I think that reaching students earlier, reaching students in college, reaching students. I generally teach graduate students, reaching students even in high school to sort of educate them and let them know that this is an option, this is a field, is important. And then I think that, I think that it is important. I think there's sort of 5 components of what they really need to understand. They need to understand economics. They need to understand market. They need to understand politics. Number 2. Obviously, that's a big part of the housing sector. They need to understand finance. They need to make the numbers work. They need to understand land use law and regulations, is also a critical part of building affordable housing. And I think I would also add that they need to understand organizational management. They need to understand, I mean, a big part of affordable housing is also good property management. And so I think that's also something that as educators who want to train the next generation of affordable housing practitioners, that's a big part of it as well. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you both. It's interesting to me what I'm hearing from your responses is that really the best thing if you're looking to get into this in the future, what you're going to need is a combination of practical skills around economics and land use and regulations, but also the people skills of knowing how to serve people, knowing how to design for human beings and with their well-being in mind. So thank you for that. And we've got one last question to wrap us up. And, feel free to kind of take from anything that we've talked about here today and thinking about what this conversation covered. And so the question is just into the future, what can we do to support affordable housing production during the next economic downturn? For whatever reason that happens, whatever causes it, whether it's a giant pandemic or, financial crisis that we experienced before, what can we do to support affordable housing production during the next time we're called into action the way that we have been in this last year?
I can kick us off. I love the idea of having more automatic responses to crises so that we don't have to go back in the midst of whatever other swirl is happening in Capitol Hill and with the White House to try to say housing matters too when it feels like, and often practically the sky is falling. I also think that we could, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but we could probably all agree just not being in as much of a shortage as we are, just really scaling up these programs to more appropriate levels will help make it so that the crisis just isn't as acute for renters next time. So, hopefully, as Congress is finalizing this infrastructure bill, the level of investment in affordable housing we might see could be historic, and that could just make us better prepared to weather the next crisis, whatever it is, period. But the other area I just wanted to flag to keep an eye out for, and this isn't just about crisis response, but also just thinking about where and how we build affordable housing more generally, is the changes to the Community Reinvestment Act that are on the horizon. So I'm not wanting to bring up such a big topic towards the end of our session here, but as we think about racial equity, as we think about just how we better distribute, where the tax credit dollars are going from the investors and moving away from these outdated branch footprints, that's something that we're keeping a really close eye on because it could have a really huge impact on where we build going forward. And as the administration starts to think through that, thinking about how to make those investments more responsive and resilient to various downturns, whether it's national or regional, I think could be an important part of that process as well. So I just really appreciate having this conversation. It's been fun to think through these longer term issues while we're in this very hour by hour moment here on infrastructure legislation, but really appreciate this opportunity to kind of think bigger picture and longer term.
Yeah, and I know that our panel today is talking about capital A affordable housing, so we're interested in the subsidy programs and the tax credits and so forth. But at some point, we also have to grapple with the fact that it's too hard to build housing, and it's especially too hard to build multifamily rental housing. So you can't build LIHTC apartments someplace where the local zoning prohibits building market rate apartments. Too much of the country has just made it too difficult to build housing. It takes too long, it's too expensive, there's too much community pushback. And so I think at some point we have to grapple with this underlying process that allows existing residents, particularly long-term wealthy homeowners, to block housing projects that they don't want, which turns out to be mostly affordable housing that we would like to have available to people. So that's a much bigger sort of agenda. But I think we need to pair those, and in some sense, to stop thinking about capitally affordable housing as a problem over here to be solved with more money, and market rate housing over here to be solved with regulation. These problems are really interrelated, right? These markets overlap with one another. What you can and can't build on the market rate side affects the price of apartments that we're going to try to cover with vouchers. So at some point, I'd like us to do more political joining forces of the affordable housing advocates and sort of zoning reform advocates. These are really aiming towards the same goal, and we need to focus on them.
Yeah, I agree with both everything Jenny and Emily have said. I would sort of put it that it's almost there's sort of, let me sort of say there's sort of three buckets of responses. One is that we need to deal with these structural problems that Jenny is talking about and that Emily referenced it all as well, which, makes it so, 50%, half of renters in the United States are rent burdened. But what does that mean? It means when they hit a crisis, they haven't been able to save any money because they're spending all of their money on rent. And so they haven't been able to put any money aside to cover the inevitable financial setbacks that and unexpected, inevitable but unexpected financial setbacks that people face. And so I think addressing those long-term structural issues and getting more housing built is both capital A and small a, and frankly, just housing built will help. Number two, I do think I will underscore this point about this, the value of automatic stabilizers in housing, both on the production side, but also in terms of emergency rental assistance, which obviously will also help the owners of the affordable housing. If we could get to a universal voucher program, maybe we'd have less need for those automatic stabilizers on the emergency rental side. But that seems to me still a political lift to get there. And then the third thing I'm just going to throw in, because we haven't mentioned it, but we're talking about resilience. We're talking about, sort of resilience to economic crises, but we also have climate crises out there. And I don't know, maybe since I'm sitting here in New York City, where we just had like the craziest rainfall and damaging and deathly rainfall last week. And I think thinking about ways to make our housing stock not only resilient to economic crises, but also to the increasing climate, extreme climate events that we're going to see going forward.
Thanks. I couldn't agree more with everyone. I didn't want to leave the conversation without thanking Jenny for the great work she's done in Boston to advance zoning and TOD development. Just fantastic. I think that's the kind of work that we need to continue to do to make things happen, and incrementally, as you're saying, Jenny. It's going to take a lot more than this. I think Barack Obama once said. He said, it's going to take the all of the above strategy to get us to where we need to be. So zoning reform, I think is great, and looking for opportunities like the affordable or naturally existing affordable housing that can be developed through more accessory dwelling units that can be done in cities and in near suburbs of cities. I think that's a great strategy. But for me, a lot of this goes back to education and making sure that housing becomes a central issue in elections. I know it has been a major issue in municipal elections all over our region, anyways, and in other areas of the country. But the more it's front and center, and not as an issue that's just an economic lever or a not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard argument, but one that is genuinely talks about the benefits of having good, healthy housing is going to be beneficial. And then on a national level, I think we need to start looking for elected officials who do put this on the agenda and are forthright about it being a priority. I don't think the housing as a human right discussion is going to get on the national stage, but housing as a central electoral issue should be.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. So thank you, Ingrid and Jenny and Neil and Emily, all of you, for this excellent discussion. This was really wonderful, very thought-provoking, and we'll do it again in 10 years. And I think, hopefully we'll have a lot of different things to talk about at that point. So thank you all for being here and being a part of this event and this conversation. So at this point, everybody, we'd like to share with you something a little different. We want to tell you how the residents of NHP Foundation's rental communities benefit from the monies raised here at this event this evening. So Operation Pathways, NHPF's Residence Services subsidiary, provides bountiful activities and services that residents can partake in and use to reach their own goals. One of the outstanding highlights of Operation Pathways work this year is the Affordable Housing Internship Program, which took place across a wide range of properties, engaging the young people there in on-site training. So we are now seeing several of these interns graduate, and we wanted to share with you this video which captures the experience. So take a look.
I'm Kevin Lewis, Assistant Vice President, Resident Services, and Deputy Executive Director, Operation Pathways, the resident services subsidiary of the NHP Foundation. Research has demonstrated the positive impact that interventions like the low-income housing tax credit and other subsidized housing supports can have on children. Children whose families use rental assistance to move to lower poverty neighborhoods are substantially more likely to attend college and earn more as adults. To support teens in our housing communities in achieving academic and career success, the NHP Foundation's DEIJ Task Force created an intensive 8-week teen internship program that focused on acquisition, development, and management of affordable housing communities.
Throughout this program, I was able to learn a lot, but some things that stuck with me were learning how to budget and save. That way, if I have an emergency, everything will be covered. I also learned about the 50-30-20 rule, and I was able to apply that into the money that I got from this internship.
Some of the results from this year's program include 91% of participants believe they are better prepared to achieve their future educational, career, and personal goals because of the internship program. 100% of teens reported that they have an understanding of the affordable housing field, up from 42% at the start of the program. 64% of participants strongly agree that they understand how to budget, save, and manage money, up from 17% at the start of the program.
My short-term and long-term goals, some of them are, a short-term goal of mine is to get a job after school. Once this is done, I'm gonna find another place to work at. I want to finish high school and look into the military, most likely something in the Air Force. A long-term goal of mine is to start a business. I'm not exactly sure for what just yet, but I want to keep you looking. A long-term educational goal of mine is to go to college and finish college or some type of trade school. I would also have to look into that because my career choices keep changing.
Won't you be a part of helping deserving teens achieve academic and career success with your donation to our service-enriched housing tonight? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ken White, Executive Director of Operation Pathways. I hope you enjoyed seeing the young people at our properties learning about the work of affordable housing in such a hands-on way. We appreciate so much seeing the joy that they're experiencing. We know this training will stay with them as they navigate their future. That is a fundamental part of the job of resident services in affordable housing, walking along our residents as they map out their futures. Although the title of this event is A Decade of Rental Housing Vulnerability and Creating More Resilient Housing is the goal, I do want to point out that we work with residents who have made our housing their home for more than a decade. In some cases, raising children who have taken part in programs from after-school homework help to on-site internships and on to successful adult lives. And none of it would be possible without generous contributors like all of you. Please take a moment here to contribute to Operation Pathways to keep services like our teen internship programs flourishing by texting 844-329-2977 and entering OP in the message box.